All right, good morning and welcome everyone. So I think for some of you it might not be morning, but it is here. So thanks for joining us. Today I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we learned in our experience in Puerto Rico. We sent our Energy Express van down there recently for a little tour. Met with a number of installers, distributors, and the like on the island, as well as a number of homeowners that would come out for different events. So the van's still down there with some of our colleagues from the Cala region. And just want to walk through a little bit about what happened, with Hurricane Maria and how people are getting through that, how people are preparing for the next time it happens, and what we as an industry can take away from this to help these guys in the future, as well as, of course, grow the opportunity to expand solar and the benefits that it provides. So an important thing to understand about the situation that Puerto Rico had after the hurricane is to understand a little bit more about what happened or what Puerto Rico was like before the hurricane. So, we have to keep in mind that the utility there, PREPA, was already bankrupt. So you had a lot of maintenance that was being deferred. They just couldn't afford it. So you didn't have exactly a grid that was in great shape to begin with. You had most of that power coming from fossil fuels, a lot of oil generation, and things, and a lot of that, because it was, kind of dirty and whatever, was set up on the opposite side of the island from where most of the people lived. So that played into it quite a bit. You had a real reticence on the part of the utility to allow more PV interconnection, in part because they're financially strapped. They don't want to deal with the technical issues of integrating a lot of PV. So you had a lot of systems denied on technicalities. You had a typical 8-month waiting period for a grid net metering system. So that was, plus they started requiring a lot of the Rule 21 style or, requirements around ride-throughs and frequency response and so forth. So, before the storm, people were still focused on even with all of that, the net metered PV, and there weren't that many out there really focused on, battery systems that could provide, resilience and backup and, other types of grid connected energy storage services, as you would expect in, say, California or Hawaii. The storm, of course, was pretty devastating. Even to the renewable energy on the island. So, PV is not exempt from hurricane damage. It's just easier to repair. You see a lot of pretty severe damage, a lot of down power lines, and it wasn't so much the generation that was destroyed in the hurricane. It was the distribution, right? So getting the power from the power plant, which was repaired relatively quickly, but getting that out to the people, on the grid was much more difficult because you had to repair so many down power lines and different types of things like that. It was a pretty tough situation, even in the best of times. So one of the big things that's been an issue since the storm is getting the power back online. So the top picture here shows kind of the night sky, everybody lit up prior to the storm, and then after the storm, I don't know exactly how many months after, but it's still more or less like that. I think it's a little bit brighter today than when that bottom picture was taken, but there's still a lot of people on the island with no power. And that's changed life for a lot of folks. One of the things I was reading just this morning, there's some follow-up reporting done on, the human consequences of the storm, right? So there were something like 64, 65 casualties reported directly from, people getting killed in the hurricane from high winds and falling things and so on. But if you take into account the people that have died since then, from not having access to electricity or transportation to get medical help, to get whatever, that number is something more like 4,500. So it's a big deal to put people in that situation without power for such a long time. And so, where are we today? So while we were there, FEMA actually announced the conclusion of the federal work, and most of the FEMA representatives left the island actually the day before I flew back. So they were, out on the 18th, that Friday, they all basically packed up and went home. Now there's still some Army Corps of Engineers folks there, but the work that's being done now is no longer part of the federal recovery effort. That was declared finished. It's going to take years to rebuild the grid. As a result, there are still today, by PREPA's report, 13,000 residents still don't have power, and that's the number from the utility. So one could assume that it's probably underreported. Even if you've got a grid tie system, if you don't have a battery, it's not usable when there's no grid. And so that's a lesson that a lot of folks hadn't realized. I was surprised at how many of the homeowners we talked to that said, yeah, I had a PV system. I thought I would have power when the grid went down, and didn't realize that without the battery, that it just doesn't work that way. So educating those consumers on the difference between a straight grid tie system and something with a battery, like one of the OutBack products, is part of what has to happen. And we'll talk more about that. A lot of those guys, because outages, even before the storm, were fairly commonplace. A lot of folks have generators, but getting fuel around right after a natural disaster is an issue. And even in the best of times, it's pretty expensive, especially when you're outside the cities and the distribution system, because all that fuel has to be imported to the island. And so, you've got folks there with, without power at all. If you go into the cities, hey, the grid's back up, more or less, but it's still very fragile. So there were several outages just during the week that I was there, and they would last anywhere from 15 minutes to a few hours. Talking with some folks that lived in San Juan, long term, they're saying, oh yeah, having a blackout that lasts a day or two is not that uncommon, and you're going to have hour-long outages several times a week. So it's one of those things where people are just sort of used to the new reality. And then, of course, as most people heard about, there was island-wide blackout in early May when one of the reconstruction subcontractors, basically miswired something and took the whole island down for about a day and a half. So even now, it's very fragile. So that leads to a lot of consumer interest for off-grid systems, right? If you're one of those 13,000 people that hasn't had electricity in 8 months, you're very interested in an off-grid system. Because here you're talking about, hey, if an investment of, say, $10,000 to $15,000, and you can have power again. It's not going to necessarily be as much power as you might have used from the grid, but you've got something. You can run your refrigerator, you can turn on some lights, you can watch TV, you can charge your cell phone. I mean, these are the kind of everyday things that you don't think about when you have ready access to them. And even in the areas where they do have grid power restored, the interconnection process for doing a grid tie system is still very lengthy. And so if in some cases it's faster just to install a completely off-grid system. And there's plenty of customers that basically said, look, I don't care if I ever reconnect, just give me power. Screw the grid. I want to be independent because I can manage it myself, and if I'm in control of it, then I've got the ability to keep my own lights on next time this happens. So there's a lot of pent-up demand, and people are hungry for this kind of solution. And so now when a solar installer comes and visits a customer, they're expecting at least a quote for a backup system. It's no longer enough for the installer to say, oh yeah, I'll put in a grid tie inverter and we'll save you X dollars on your power bill. It's like, no, what are you going to do for me when the power goes out? And that's going to be really important because, as I mentioned, the infrastructure is still incredibly fragile. And it's not going to take another Hurricane Maria to put Puerto Rico back to where they were 8 months ago. A significant tropical storm could probably do it because it's so weakened. You knock down a couple power lines and half the island's without power. And in a very local basis, you might have regions on the island that get cut off again, and who knows when they'll be able to get brought back online. So very strong interest for these solutions. It really comes down to how can I keep my home powered? How can I keep my business going? And ultimately, how can I afford it? And we'll talk about that. But some of the solutions being deployed, some of it's pretty standard stuff. Some of it's actually pretty creative. So one of the more common ones that you see is, kind of our everyday stuff. So here's a typical Radian installation, a couple of FM80 charge controllers, a nice little PV array on the roof. This is a suburban home. It's installed there in the garage. You've got a real standard OutBack system. Gets installed by a local installer, and it's net metered. And then when the grid goes down, it isolates the protected loads and keeps those running indefinitely from the solar power. This system's also pretty helpful because in a lot of cases, these guys already have a generator. Well, if you put in a system like this with, say, a Radian, you've got a port you can hook the generator to, and now you've got that if there's an extended time where, say, your solar panels were damaged or you're just not getting enough sunshine, you've got the generator as well that hooks into that system. It makes it all nice and clean. So this is a great solution for a lot of your suburbanites, the folks that have a little bit of money. They're going to this pretty widely. The challenge is, it's a little more expensive. It's not something that everyone on the island can afford. And so, there you need to start looking at more centralized solutions. So one of the real basic ones, and this was done right after the storm. So one of our partners, Sunrun, worked with a nonprofit there. Then they put in an OutBack system with another 8 kilowatt Radian, one of the big 800 RE batteries, and they powered a local fire station. And then they're repeating this in several other places. And, they, within a few weeks of the storm, were able to bring this power station back online where, the lights could come on, they could answer the phone, they could start serving the community again. And when you have these centralized locations like a fire station or a school or a local clinic, your hospitals typically already have backup power, but they become beacons for the community. And so, during a couple of the extended blackouts that they had since then, the power station ran on the backup system. People could come there, if nothing else, get warm, charge their phones, get some ice, whatever it is that they needed to do, because they had power there in the community. And so this is one way to make sure that the folks that can't afford their own system, have access to electricity nearby, as you set up some of these. And they're there. And then when the power is up, they're saving money on their electric bills. So it's really a win-win for these guys to do these kinds of systems. And so the outfit down there, Empowered by Light, their aim is to put a system like this on virtually every power station on the island. So it's a great way to start solving the problem. Another nonprofit effort that we got involved with one of our customers, Sesame Solar. This is actually getting deployed today in Dominica, which is island close to Puerto Rico, also devastated by Hurricane Maria. And this one's being set up near a hospital. So in this case, you have a containerized, mobile solution where the PV is already integrated, our equipment is already integrated. There's some simplified batteries in there, so it's got a nice, robust, adaptable power supply system. And then you would store this somewhere on an island like that, or somewhere in a zone where a hurricane or a disaster like that is is likely, and then afterwards, you pull it out and you go put it wherever it needs to be. So it's a great temporary solution. If necessary, you could set something like this up fairly long term. It can be there for months or even years, and then move it again, the next time that it's needed. So these are great solutions, and those of you that are in that line of business would encourage you to reach out to Sesame and take a look at some of their stuff. But it's a great way to solve this, right? They call these little nano grids that you can just kind of drop in place and go with. So another kind of more larger, more involved solution to this would be a local microgrid. So a little community microgrid, similar idea to like the nano grid, except this is going to be a bigger system. This is usually a few hundred kilowatts, and you're going to deploy that in a small community or an apartment building or something like that, where it can run and save money during normal times, and then during an outage, it can isolate that community and power the loads from a renewable energy system. So this is a lot more involved. You're going to have to work with the people that are going to be on this microgrid to make sure they know how to manage their loads during an outage, and so they don't overpower the microgrid system or use up all the battery power, for example. And then figuring out your metering and how all that's going to get billed, because in most cases when you deploy this kind of system, you're acting as a little miniature utility for these guys. And this is a solution, obviously, that's gaining a lot of traction, here in the mainland. And I think for these island situations where you're using it as a resilience strategy, it's fairly powerful. So that's probably the belt and suspenders way to do this for some of the communities where they can't afford their own individual systems. So moving into some of the things that we learned, while we were there, we did, like I said, we did a fair bit of outreach with local installers and community members. So the event pictured here was, we went into a modest suburban gated community, and basically just set up shop for a couple hours in the evening, and we had a number of residents come out and just ask questions. How does this work? What do I do with this bit of equipment, or what is this for versus that? And so the gentleman that set this up was a local installer who happened to live in the neighborhood, just starting right there at home. And it was a really interesting evening. I think one of the key takeaways is this was pretty much all conducted in Spanish, which is the local language. So I'm not a Spanish speaker myself, and so I had to rely on my colleagues, Miguel and Miguel, as well as our host, to kind of manage everything. But it was a really interesting to watch people's kind of expressions and how they would react to, oh, this is all it costs, or this is all that's involved with that. A lot of folks have an idea that this is incredibly complicated and that it's not attainable. And as education is getting out there and people are understanding, oh, this is something that can be done. This is something that's relatively straightforward. We can do this in our community. We can, go and get, financing for this. We can, buy this stuff, and it'll save us money the rest of the time. And interestingly, a lot of people that are looking at this are saying, oh, well, we can be completely independent of the utility. So they're actually going all the way from grid tie to completely off grid. So, and again, just to express the frustration that they feel with the situation there in a lot of places. And I think another training element here that must not be ignored is we also need to provide a lot of training to the installer community. As I said before, most of the installers on the island, before the storm, pretty much focused on standard grid tie systems. And now they're all being asked to do these battery systems, and some of them, just have never done that. So getting out there, and this is kind of the purpose of our trip primarily, was spend some time with these guys. We did a couple of full day trainings while I was there. There's the additional trainings went on up until today, and tomorrow there's gonna be a big consumer event just south of San Juan, helping people prepare for the hurricanes. And it's not just the homeowners and the people that are going to buy the systems. We also have to train, the installers themselves. As most of you are aware, working with batteries is a little different than doing a straight grid tie installation. And you've got to size the system differently. There's a lot more variables to work out. And so getting people that information, and also in some cases, teaching them how to properly sell a battery system is important. It's not uncommon to see an installer go and either oversell or undersell the capabilities of that battery system. And both of those are unhelpful. Overselling is particularly dangerous. Oh yeah, this will run your entire house and all you have to do is, flip the switch. Well, that may not necessarily be the case. You've got to size it properly for that. And so I think, one of the risks with untrained installers, particularly in this kind of situation, is undersizing the systems so that they can win the deal. But then, when the homeowner goes to use it, and it's going to be typically in a disaster scenario, it's not going to do everything it's supposed to do, and that's going to cause some frustration to start going toward the solar industry. And I think we need to be careful to avoid that. But managing expectations, right? This is what you're buying, this is what it'll do, this is what it won't do, and make sure that everyone's on the same page as far as what they can expect from their system. The other side of it is basic load management stuff. I mean, these guys our consumers, not unlike we are here on the mainland. Most people don't think about the electricity that they're using, the power. Most people couldn't tell you that a hair dryer is a bigger load than a refrigerator in some cases. So they just aren't that tuned in, and you've got to sort of educate them about those types of things as part of that process. And that's why, this particular event, most of the people there, we had probably about a dozen homeowners come out, and they stayed for about 3 hours asking questions, going through those kinds of things, those kinds of details. Okay, so this will run a refrigerator and a computer, but I probably can't run my toaster or my hair dryer very often. And having those kinds of conversations with these people before the system gets sold, it becomes incredibly important. So obviously the other side of this is, how are people going to afford it? And one of the things we found that was really interesting is a lot of the local banks, right? There's a lot of these little co-op banks, kind of like credit unions. They're like the main source of financing for these things. And so people come and they can get a 10-year loan for a PV system, and they just work with their local bank. And it's great because this is how you buy everything else. This is how you would buy a car or a house or what have you. And you're talking about a similar amount of money. That was something that sort of evolved. I think it was starting to happen before the storm, and then after the storm, I think these local banks realized, hey, here's a way we can really serve our community, and it's great for business. So they developed these loans that people can go and get. And that's what makes these solutions more accessible to folks that could afford it on a monthly basis because it is saving them money on their power bill, but couldn't afford the cash up front, right? It's the classic solar finance dilemma. And these guys stepped right into the breach and solved that, and it was incredibly powerful. So the other thing we saw was a lot of interest in these sort of small, low-cost off-grid systems. And the difference here between that and, say, one of our sort of normal, PV battery backup systems is, in our normal system, we would wire it into the home, and it would net meter during the time when the grid was up, and then it would isolate protected loads, and all of that would happen sort of automatically during an outage. But for the folks that couldn't afford that solution, they're still very interested in something that costs maybe $4,000 or $5,000, but that is completely independent of the grid. It's just kind of it's almost like a backup generator type of solution. You've got a small inverter, with a charge controller, or an all-in-one PCU, such as the one pictured there. That's a product that we've just introduced for the Latin America market called the Alino. And it's exactly that. It's a low-cost, all-in-one inverter where it's got a charge controller built in. You wire in your array. You've only got typically a couple kilowatts of power. You have 2 to 4 modules on the string, and a small battery bank, and then that feeds basically a power strip. So you'll have these guys, they'll put in that kind of a thing, and then in a storm situation where there's a long-term blackout, they'll go mount the modules up on the roof. They'll run their loads from the inverter and the battery, and they'll keep their refrigerator going and maybe their TV and just a couple of things. The necessities that they're going to miss otherwise, right? Even if a lot of cases, even if they can just charge their cell phones, that's incredibly important. So these solutions were a lot more popular and interesting to people than I think I personally expected, because to me it feels so inconvenient, but it's an affordable solution for these guys in that situation, and it makes a big difference. The other one, as we mentioned before, is these sort of larger community-based microgrids and community-based backup systems. Those are going to take a while to really get going, but that's one of the directions we see a lot of the bigger providers working in, and some of the municipalities are digging into those types of solutions for long-term resilience. And it'll be interesting to see how those play out. Obviously, financing those systems is a lot more complicated than going to a local co-op bank. So remains to be seen. I think that's a really promising avenue for some of these communities as well. So that's basically the formal presentation. I'll open up to questions. Did want to mention first that if you guys haven't been to training, as we've been talking about, we offer the certificate training program. It's NAPSEP credit hours. So you get 18 contact hours if you're working for your first certification, or 12 hours of continuing education credits towards your 3-year renewal. So we'll have the next one in June in Phoenix, and then in July up here in Arlington right after Intersolar. So if you mention this webinar when you register, we'll give you $100 off. It's actually a pretty great deal. The normal price is I think around $400, and it's 4 days of intensive training, either here at our headquarters or down in Phoenix at our training center, whichever is more convenient for you. We've got some top-notch training talent. You get your hands on the equipment. We walk through a lot of the programming and the things that make an install go well. So with that, let me see if there's any questions. Feel free to text those in, or you can raise your hand. I'm pretty sure that works. So, okay, so is the small affordable package you described for Latin American market available in the US? Not at this time. It's a fairly new product, and we're looking at bringing a future version of that to the US. Right now, the version that we have is geared for the Latin American grid, and it doesn't have all the listings and certifications and things that our US product typically requires. So we plan to bring something like it to the US in the next year or so. It'll be probably a slightly different product, probably a little bit more expensive, just because, again, it's got to have all the different listings and certifications that American customers are required to have. Let me see here. Let's see. System. So fairly detailed question from Lloyd. Feel free to reach out to me afterwards, Lloyd, and I'll try to help you out with that. I don't think that's something I could address here on the call. Okay, so here's another one. Oh, this is Lloyd, sorry. Dorado, Puerto Rico, 8 kilowatt off-grid system, OutBack just 48 Aqueon batteries in 2016. Performed splendidly throughout the storms. Tech support supervisor. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah, so like I said, Lloyd, just reach out to me. If you put my name on the email address here, that'll get to me, and we'll take care of your support question. That's going to require a little more information from you, so we'll try to manage that otherwise. Any other questions that you guys have? If not, then maybe we'll wrap up early here. Oh, here we go. Taking place. Okay. You have to forgive me, the question interface here on my my webinar software is not great. So what changes have you noticed that may have taken place with the Puerto Rico electric utility after Maria? Have they taken a different attitude toward connection? Surprisingly, no. And you know, in fairness to PREPA, I mean, they're pretty beleaguered, and they were beleaguered even before the storm. So these guys are just getting beat up left and right. And I think it just comes down to they don't have time to deal with it. So, you know, they're basically saying, you know, here's the thing, meet the thing, and we'll process you when we process you. And you know, I kind of get where they're coming from, but at the same time, it is leading to tremendous frustration, you know, from the Puerto Ricans, you know, toward PREPA to say, hey, you know, these guys haven't delivered power in 8 months, and I have to assume they're not going to. So again, that's a lot of what's driving the off-grid interest there. And there isn't a lot of sign that that is sort of changing their attitude about solar or any of that. You know, I think they're fine with solar. You know, like most utilities, it's really a question of, you know, is it distributed generation, or is it generation that they own and distribute? So it remains to be seen. I think there's some interesting stuff politically going on there. There's talk about privatizing PREPA, basically selling it to a larger utility. We don't know how any of that's going to play out yet, but obviously it's going to impact, you know, how they treat you know, PV going forward. Battery delivery lead times. Yeah, so one of the consequences for us of Hurricane Maria last year was it really wiped out the battery supply chain. I mean, just basically every spare bit of lead went into batteries for, you know, the affected islands, so Puerto Rico being one of the main ones. But as we said, also Dominica, and then you had you know, pretty massive outages in even Florida and Texas around that same time. So we're just now getting back on track. We also, as part of you know, our response to that, have reached out to additional battery suppliers. So you'll see very soon we'll be rolling out some new batteries. So you'll hear about you know, the pure lead battery, pure lead carbon batteries. So we're expanding our supply chain base to be able to get you guys batteries in a more prompt turnaround time. So that's something that we're very actively managing, and we will have some formal announcements out soon. But the good news is that we do have now, you know, some batteries in stock. So if there's particular things you need, you know, we are out of the NCs at the moment, but we do have some REs in stock, and we've got some of the new batteries in stock as well. So if you're interested in that, I'd say reach out to your rep or your distributor, and we'll get you squared away. I am Paul Daly, by the way, so I am the Director of Product Management here. Usually how much capacity in the battery bank. So this depends a lot on how you're sizing the system, right? So we talked about, a smaller system versus a larger system, and you have to size the battery bank as well as the PV array. So in a grid tie system, all you really care about is, okay, this person uses X number of kilowatt hours a year, so I need an array that produces about that much a year. With an off-grid system, there's a time element, right? So it's more, this person's using, 15 kilowatt hours a day in the summer and, 10 in the winter. I need to size an array and a battery that's going to provide for that and get recharged the following day. So typically what we see just in terms of, of deployments, I would say most of the batteries getting installed in sort of a regular OutBack system are going to be at least 10 kilowatt hours in terms of usable capacity. There are some smaller systems, but that's typically more of an exception. And then 20, 25 kilowatt hour battery package is pretty common. Larger than that is certainly possible, but it's a lot less frequent, right? That's typically a very large home or a business or something like that where you need more energy storage. Okay, any further questions? I'll give you guys another couple minutes here, and then if we have more questions, I'm happy to stay on and answer them for a while. If not, I'll give you your 20 minutes back. Oh, sorry. Director of Product Management. Okay. Okay, so I've got a question for more information on the trainings. Let me back up the slide here. You can go to our website. So if you go to outbackpower.com and click on installers and then resources, there's a link to our certificate training program page, which has all of the dates for the trainings this year, as well as a detailed description of the class agenda, links to registration forms, and all that good stuff. You can also, if you email us at support@outbackpower.com, we can also answer your questions directly and send you those links. Let's see, is there an adequate number of design installation companies down there now, or a shortage? Recommendations for involvement from US companies interested in developing products in the Virgin Islands or Puerto Rico? That's a good question. I'm not sure I have a definitive answer on that. I think there are quite a few installers on the island. That said, there's plenty of activity coming from people, from other parts of the world, particularly the US mainland, to help out down there. So, is there a business opportunity to go down there and install solar? Yeah, absolutely. Is it right for your company? Is it a good opportunity in your particular case? That's really going to depend. I would say if that's something you're considering, best thing to do is get down there for a week or two and talk to people and scope it out. We have Glenn International is our one of our distributors down there. They were incredibly helpful during the trip, and they know the market pretty well. They'd probably be good guys to talk with about kind of what does the market look like, how much, how many folks are actually busy and in what areas. So they'd be good guys to reach out to. And then Warren Del Caribe is our other distributor, in a similar situation. They've got a lot of access on all the distributors, or excuse me, the installers as well. And then of course we have people coming from the mainland and doing work directly, buying product here, which is fine as well. We prefer to run it through distribution there, just so that we can keep track of what's actually going to the island. Let's see, how low can you drain the battery bank? So that depends on your batteries, Joe. Typically with the lead acid batteries, you're going to want to keep it to about 50% of the nameplate capacity. That's going to preserve your battery life and give you the best efficiency. Other types of batteries, so if you're using, say, like a Simplify battery or a Blue Ion or something like that, they have different parameters, and there it's a little trickier because you've got active battery management going on inside the box. And so typically they're going to sell it based on a usable capacity. So there you can go like 90–95% on some of those batteries. Again, it depends on your battery. You're going to want to make sure you understand it's not just about how many kilowatt hours you can pull out of that battery. The rate that you pull it out is important. So you want to look at what are the current limitations and how does the capacity of the battery change with respect to the current that you're drawing from it or charging it with. So again, like I said, sizing the battery systems is a little trickier. There's a lot more variables. But as a rule of thumb, a lead acid battery, you don't go below 50%. On the lithium ions, you usually get closer to 90%. But you need to look at the battery specifically to get that answer. Let's see, a lot of good questions coming in here. Okay, great. Any other questions? So we got some good ones coming here in the last few minutes. Here we go. Off grid. Okay, so 24 kilowatt hour battery bank off grid. Yeah, so typically, Joe, in that case, assuming your 24 kilowatt hour battery bank is a lead acid, either a flooded or a VRLA battery, you're probably gonna pull that down to about you'll get about 12 kilowatt hours out of that before you want to recharge it. You can, of course, in some cases go a little lower or not, or a little shallower, but it's going to impact your cycle life of the battery. Let's see, question from Jonathan. Having potable water was a big issue in Puerto Rico. Could emergency solar water pumping systems have been implemented to help with the situation? Absolutely. So that's something that we saw a lot after the earthquake in Haiti, the tsunami in Sri Lanka, in places like that where it disrupted all the systems. So Puerto Rico had similar issues, and there were a lot of projects where, in most cases in Puerto Rico, I believe it was more water filtration, whereas in other places it's reactivating a well. And so there are solar solutions for both of those. As far as well pumps go, you can certainly run an AC well pump off of one of our systems. Alternatively, there's direct solar pumps that can work well for wells. And if you're talking about filtration, you need to power, say, an ion exchange membrane or something like that for osmosis, you can certainly do that with a system like ours. It's pretty straightforward. And there are companies and nonprofits. Water Missions is one that does a lot of work in that area. There's other similar agencies and NGOs that do precisely that. So if that's something you're interested in getting into, look around. There's a lot of folks that know a lot about it, a lot more than me. But yeah, absolutely, solar can help there. Let's see. Please explain depth of discharge versus charging cycle. So this is kind of back to Joe again. When you a depth of discharge basically is if a battery's it's the reverse of a battery's state of charge, right? So if the battery's state of charge is 80%, the depth of discharge is 20%. And so the way we used to deal with batteries was more on the depth of discharge side. So you'd say, yeah, this battery can have 50% depth of discharge, or this battery can have 80% depth of discharge. And then there's typically a graph you'll find on battery spec sheets that says, here's the depth of discharge versus the cycle life, right? So if you look at, say, for example, our 200RE batteries, you're going to get about 1,500 cycles at 50% depth of discharge, right? And if you go down to 80% depth of discharge on a sort of averaged basis, that cycle life drops off to under 1,000. So you've got to kind of understand that curve, and that's really what I'm referencing there. When you asked about how much can you discharge the batteries, you can discharge any battery to 100% at least once. But the real question is, if you want to recharge it and use it again later, you got to be a little bit more careful. So hopefully that answers your question. If not, happy to follow up by email later. Let's see, good question from Evan here. Imagine that there is still frustration with the mainland government and level of support, but FEMA's pulling out. Is the level of frustration more? Hard to say. I mean, that was literally happening as I left. So, people knew it was coming for a long time. I didn't sense that there was any great sort of hostility from most people, but there was kind of this war-weary, like, I'm just tired of dealing with it and I'm not going to think about it type of mentality. So I think people, you can be frustrated for so long, and then eventually you start to become a little bit more apathetic. And I think unfortunately a lot of the folks there are kind of moving from frustration to apathy with respect to federal government support, at least. So that's not much more I can say about that without getting political, which I'm not prepared to do in this context, at least. So yeah, I mean, the federal government said, hey, this is the typical FEMA thing. We're done. It's a time-based deal. It's over. That's not to say that there's nobody there helping them, right? There's a lot of NGOs there doing work on the island. There's a lot of government agencies helping out. It's just that the formal FEMA work is finished. So, yeah. And in fairness, there is plenty to criticize in terms of the the U.S. federal government's response to the storm. But you also have to keep in mind this is not an island that I mean, they were already in the hole before this started in terms of financially. So there's bigger issues at play here than just storm recovery, and that makes everything else more complicated. Again, not to give anyone excuses, but you have to keep the whole context in mind. All right, any final questions? Okay, local salesperson, Ventura County. So our rep down there is Rob Robinson. He's out of Santa Barbara. If you're looking for just getting some gear in Ventura, I would recommend either your local CED or AEE Solar. They have an office up in San Luis Obispo, but I mean they ship out pretty much everywhere. So those are a couple good options. Solagent's also present down there. So any of our normal distributors can certainly help you out. Ventura is a pretty easy place to get to in most cases. So, all right. Well, thank you, everybody. And Amoresco, don't let me forget. They can also help you out wherever you are. Most of those guys are national. Okay, so thanks everybody, and I'll give you the last 10 minutes back. So appreciate y'all joining us, and hopefully, there's more we as an industry can do, to A, prevent things like this by addressing climate change, and B, respond when it happens. And I think we're, as OutBack, very pleased to be able to help out in these situations, as part of our core business. So any follow-up, feel free to reach out to us at support there. If you address it, if you put my name in there, they'll make sure it gets to me, and I can respond accordingly. And and of course, we also have our Facebook feed, our LinkedIn feed, and our user forum on our website. So would encourage you all to interact in any of those formats that work best for you. All right, well, thanks very much, and we'll catch you next time.